Brad, I hope you're having a great week. Welcome into the game in Tuscaloosa.
Thank you, Ryan. It's been a good week. We've finally gotten enough days out that my ears stopped ringing from Tiger Stadium on Saturday night. That was as loud as I have ever heard a stadium. Fortunately for Alabama, they didn't allow LSU to have much to cheer about because that crowd, especially you saw it on that opening drive, it was a difference-making level of noise. Like I said, they just couldn't sustain it without their team making any big plays.
Yeah, and going into that environment, does it give you a little bit more of appreciation of this Alabama team, or did it kind of just exceed or meet your expectations?
Well, look, I think what you can see right away is just how different this offense is because in a lot of ways that game was similar to what we've seen the last few times that Alabama has played down there. Certainly LSU seemed to take the same approach. It seemed to be a very similar LSU type of team. And if Alabama didn't have the big playability that it has on offense, especially in the passing game, it very well could have been another one of those, really low-scoring games in the second half that kind of goes into the fourth quarter with LSU having every reason to believe they could win. It made a big difference for Alabama just being able to make a few more plays offensively and be able to get that crowd out of the game much earlier than they normally would have. And because of that, they ended up not having to sweat the fourth quarter in the way that they had the previous few times down there.
Well, and coming out of that game, we talked about it last week. You said that you just didn't see any way that LSU could play with Alabama and that you thought that this score was going to be very similar. I don't exactly remember the exact score, but you thought Alabama was going to win pretty comfortable. Looking at the respect that this committee has for LSU, putting them at number 7, is that respect for LSU or respect for Alabama kind of keeping that little margin of error there?
Yeah, I think it's respect for Alabama, but I think it's also that the way that the committee is set up is that this is not like the polls where a lot of people who fill out a ballot will just on a Sunday morning will take out their ballot from the previous week and they'll just move teams up that won, move teams down that lost, and that's kind of how they do it. The process the selection committee goes through allows them to, as much as possible, to start with a clean slate each week, talk through it, and I'm guessing they have the same conversations over and over one week after the next. And what we saw is that the wins that LSU had, the quality wins that allowed them to be up at number 3 the previous week, were still there. Those wins were still on their resume after the Alabama game. They just had one more loss, and I think that's why they didn't fall as far as they did. And I think the other thing about it that really confuses people is that the committee rankings are not necessarily a reflection of the pecking order as far as likelihood to make the playoff. And so even though LSU is sitting there at number 7 this week, that doesn't mean that they have a better chance of getting in the playoff than West Virginia or Ohio State, who happen to be ranked behind them right now. And so I think that's kind of a disconnect with a lot of fans. So I absolutely understand why they put LSU still as high as number 7, and I think part of it is they're saying that there's nothing shameful in getting blown out by Alabama, that pretty much everybody else would.
All right, looking at this committee, is this a guess? But let's say that Alabama beats Mississippi State, they beat the Citadel, they beat Auburn, they go to Atlanta, they play Georgia, and Georgia finds a way to beat Alabama. Do you see them dropping out of the top 4?
I think it depends on a number of factors, one of which is how does Alabama look in those wins leading up to that point? If they dominate Mississippi State and Auburn the way that they have every other team up till now, then I think it certainly helps their case to be able to survive a loss. I do think that the worst case for the selection committee is if Clemson and Notre Dame were both to win out, and of course Georgia wins out up until the SEC championship game and then beats Alabama, then you're basically looking at, okay, a one-loss Alabama versus the Big Ten champ versus the Big 12 champ. And if the Big Ten and Big 12 have one-loss champions, especially if it's a one-loss Michigan, it would have won 12 in a row to end the season since losing the opener against Notre Dame. They obviously have had some good wins along the way. They have dominated in a lot of those wins. That would be a really tough call for the committee. And, Ryan, my feeling is right now that Michigan would probably get the nod in that scenario. So if you're Alabama, you don't want to see that one play out. Now, I think if it ends up being, a comparison to the Big 12 champ, or even if it's an Ohio State winning the Big 10, I think it's a different story. But the way that Michigan has been playing lately, it's not like Michigan isn't passing the eye test too. They might not be as good as Alabama, but you don't want it to come down to that point where it's the whole conference champ versus non-champion thing. That worked out well for the Tide last year when they were being compared against a 2-loss conference champ, but I'm not sure it would come out in their favor this time if it's a 1-loss champ.
Brad, I'm not even sure how this is decided. I should know this because I've watched Alabama go to the playoffs every single year. You got Dallas and you got Miami. You got Santa Clara, California. How is it decided which team goes where? Would Alabama, and let's just say they continue to win, does Dallas have the number 1 seed, or do you know the answer to that?
Yeah, the answer is that the committee's responsibility is to not put the number 1 overall seed at a crowd disadvantage.
Okay.
So if Alabama's the 1 seed, what they're going to do is look at the opponent, who's the 4 seed. Now, if it happened to be Oklahoma, then the game will be in Miami.
Okay.
They're not going to put Alabama, Oklahoma in Arlington because the assumption would be that would be Oklahoma's crowd advantage being much closer to them. But I think if it's anybody else, if it's Notre Dame, if it's Michigan, it probably wouldn't make a difference. And in that case, I'm guessing that they would probably send Alabama to Dallas. And Clemson, if they're the 2 seed, would probably make more sense for them to go to Miami. So that's kind of the way I break it down, is that Alabama, I'm guessing, will go to Dallas if they're the 1 seed, as long as Oklahoma's not the 4.
Gotcha.
Take that for what it's worth. But that's the way the committee is supposed to do it. It's just don't put the number 1 seed at a crowd disadvantage.
Well, and I know Nick Saban would probably kill us, but sometimes you got to make these travel arrangements. It's better to buy tickets in November to Santa Clara than it is late December. And if you travel one of those cheap airlines like I do, you can always move it around a little bit. So it's better.
Santa Clara is a different story, as you know, because that's making the assumption that they're winning the semifinal game on top of winning everything else to that point. But that's certainly a conversation that a lot of people in that state are having right now, is where they want to spend their money and which tickets they want to try to get now.
Brad, we have watched a lot of different people throw out this comments that maybe this is the greatest Nick Saban team. We're now hearing that, maybe this team arguably has something to say, that when you talk about some of the greatest football teams ever in college football history, that this team, this 2018 team, if they continue on this pace, defense waking it up, that they could at least throw their name into the pot and say, hey, we're part of the conversation. 2018 Alabama. Is that fair to make that going into these final 3 regular season games? Do you think this team has a chance to be a part of that conversation?
I think it's fair to say that they have a chance to be. You can't ever take a team at this stage of the season and say that they are,
sure,
or even that they probably are, because in order to get into that conversation, you not only have to go undefeated and win the national championship, but you also have to be clearly the better team in every game. Like I don't think any team that has a close call along the way is going to be considered by most people to be the greatest of all time. I mean, to me, the one that kind of stands out from all the others, and I'm not saying they're the most talented team of all time, but the most dominant team relative to everyone they played that season was 1995 Nebraska. And I'm basically talking like since 1950. You go back before then, and there are all sorts of teams that, for one reason or another, just didn't play anybody, and they might have dominated everyone. But in more modern college football, 95 Nebraska won every game by 14 points or more. The only other team to do that was 2004 Utah. Okay, and obviously they weren't a national title contender, a very good team, but they never had to play an elite team somewhere along the way. So that, to me, is kind of the standard. Certainly people will point to, like, 2001 Miami as the most talented team of all time, but they didn't dominate every opponent, most of them, but not all of them. And so I think ultimately, what they do against Mississippi State, Auburn, Georgia, the semifinal, and then, of course, the national championship game. Think about that 95 Nebraska team and what they did to Florida in that national championship game. And I'm not saying it would have to be that much of a rout, but I think that the team would have to be clearly the better team on the field in every game they played the rest of the way for people to, look, there's a recency bias. People are always going to think more fondly of whatever the last thing they saw is. And so if Alabama maybe has a close game against Georgia, but then dominates the semifinal and the national championship game, you'll have people saying, yeah, this is the greatest team ever. But I think when you really go back and start to look at it, they've got to be decidedly better than everyone they face the rest of the way in order to come out on top on that argument, or in that argument once we get years down the road and distance ourselves a little bit from the season.
But how good can this team be when you look – because I remember something published with Chris Lowe on your website, ESPN.com, talking about this is going to be a different team. We're going to have to score points. The defense may not be where they need to be. But here we go. Maybe it's false confidence that you got in Baton Rouge, but this defense to me is waking it up, and it's growing up right in front of our eyes. You combine that with this historic offense, this team is going to be very, very nasty, going to be very, very difficult to beat in this final 2 months of the season.
Yeah, and look, I'm not saying I don't give them a chance to do everything that I just talked about, but even the next couple of games, at least the next couple of conference games, Mississippi State, we know, is challenged to throw the ball. Auburn has been challenged to run the ball. And so you would expect Alabama's improving defense to play pretty well in those games. And obviously any defense is going to have a hard time holding Alabama under 30 like LSU did. Clearly it took 2 missed extra points to keep them under 30. But even then, there were some things like LSU not turning the ball over until the very end of the game. LSU kept its penalties down. They won the field position battle all night. It took all of that to keep Alabama under 30. So, the one thing you can't do is make mistakes, and we'll see if Mississippi State can manage to do that as well. But I think the bigger test is going to be Georgia. Like, to me, I think, and look, our metrics say that the third best team in the nation is Georgia. And so because of that, I believe the SEC championship game is going to be more challenging than the national semifinal. I think the only one that could be more difficult than the SEC championship would be the national championship, and that would be only if Clemson ends up being the team Alabama plays. So the opportunity is there. I mean, you're right. The defenses, this is what we've talked about for a couple months. If that defense keeps getting better, and it looks like they are, then combine that with the offense, and it's going to be really tough, not only to beat this team, but it might be tough for, even some of the top 5 teams to play a close game against them.
Can Boston College do anything against Clemson on Saturday? Do you think they have a chance?
Yeah, so I tell you what, this would be a good opportunity to give a little preview of a conversation that we might be having, a couple of months from now before the national championship game. Is that when I look at Clemson right now, I see a team they're obviously on fire. Like the last 4 games, they've just annihilated some ACC opponents. But I see a team that against not great defenses is rushing for about 300 yards per game, just a lot of explosive plays, most of them in the running game. And that's not going to happen when they get into a semifinal or a championship game. They're going to have to be able to depend on their quarterback, Trevor Lawrence, who, as we all know, true freshman, didn't even start the first few games. And then when he did start his first game, he got knocked out in the second quarter. So he's only had 4 games now that he's basically started and finished. And they're beating people so bad, he's not getting a lot of reps because it's just not sportsmanlike to, have him throw the ball a ton of times in these games and leave him in there in the fourth quarter when they're beating people so bad. Not to mention he's not getting opportunities to test himself against good defenses. And whether that changes this weekend against BC, I don't know. But I'm guessing that by the time they get to the playoff, that their quarterback will not have seen the type of defenses that he's going to face, in the semifinal and in the national championship game. And I think that's a concern for Clemson. Now, as it applies to this weekend, if BC were to hang around, especially if they were to get a lead in the second half, that is the one question I still have about Clemson. It's not, is Trevor Lawrence talented? He's very talented. But we have not seen him in a situation where he's had to make throws. We've not seen him in a situation where the running game was not really going for him, and he was getting pressure as he was throwing. And like I said, I don't know whether we'll see that on Saturday night, but if we don't and Clemson wins easily, this is a conversation we'll have again once we get to Clemson in the playoff or even in the national championship game.
J. Brad Edwards on the Twitter account. Brad, where are you guys going this weekend? You guys going to stay in Bristol, or you guys?
We're going to Bedlam. Yeah,
okay.
We're going to see Oklahoma against Oklahoma State. I'm not expecting it to be close. Oklahoma has a great offense, maybe the only offense this season that is on a level with Alabama's. But as we know, their defense is not on a level with Alabama's. So who knows if Oklahoma State can hang in there for a while, but ultimately I think Oklahoma's got too much offense.
Well, you're seeing two Heisman frontrunners in back-to-back weeks here for Brad
That's
Edwards.
Right. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that.